Great pleasure to be here with you, this select crowd this afternoon. And I am, in fact, the new director of the Museum of Arts and Design, just 6 months into the job, and as Mary said, came over from London to take up the position. Can I ask, first of all, for a show of hands, how many of you in the audience are New Yorkers? Okay, about half of you. And how many of you have been to the Museum of Arts and Design? A few of you, okay. So, including Georgia there, my colleague. I'm hoping that all of you will come to the museum this summer. First of all, just a little bit about us as an institution. We were founded in 1956 as the Museum of Contemporary Crafts and stayed a crafts museum for a long time. For a while had the name the American Craft Museum. Some of you may remember us under that name over on 53rd Street across from the Museum of Modern Art. Well, 5 years ago, and with this new name, the Museum of Arts and Design, we moved over to our beautiful new home, which you see here, on Columbus Circle, right in the southwest corner of Central Park, a building by Brad Klopfel. And as you can see, it's an incredible platform, and it stands in an amazing position in the middle of the city. One thing that I always like to tell people is that in the 19th century, they used to actually measure distances or coordinates in New York City from the center of Columbus Circle, where the statue of Christopher Columbus is. And so we do consider ourselves to be a kind of hub or central point for the metropolis. So the exhibition that I'm going to tell you about is an exhibition called NYC Makers, the Mad Biennial. It is the first of a series of exhibitions we'll be doing every 2 years. This is kind of like our answer to the Whitney Biennial or other biennials that exist around the world in the art and design field. But what's distinctive about our show and what makes this series of exhibitions different from any other that you will encounter anywhere is that it is about makers. And so what does it mean to be a maker? What does it mean to be a maker in New York City today? Well, this is a term that we've started to use at the museum because what we want to do is be as inclusive as possible in presenting creativity to our audience. So you might think about artists or designers as creative people, but of course they're not the only creative people that we have amongst us. Carpenters or furniture makers are creative, fashion designers, and also the people that work with fashion designers, let's say pattern cutters, beaters are creative. Architects are creative, but also the builders that make the architecture that architects design are creative. People who do repair work are creative. People who build tools or machines are creative. And what we're doing at the Museum of Arts and Design, in some ways going back to our roots as a craft museum, but also in a lot of ways announcing a totally new 21st century kind of museum, a kind of museum that has not existed before anywhere, is to look at this whole spectrum of skilled creativity right across the board. So that's not only fine art and, let's say, industrial or graphic design, it's also every other kind of making that you can engage with. And what we've decided to do is look at that subject and take a cross-section of it right across New York City, all 5 boroughs of the city. So the way that we did it was, first of all, to ask everyone we knew, who is a great maker in New York City? Who would you suggest that we put in our exhibition? And ultimately, we went out to about 350 people and asked them to suggest names to us. And then, as you can see, we got about 450 nominated makers. That actually doesn't mean we got 450 names. There was a lot of duplication. Some people were nominated 9, 12 times, which is a strong, obviously a strong indication we should put them in the show. But then, at any rate, we took those 450 names, we brought them to a jury of 10 people, selected from all across the city, again, all 5 boroughs, and ultimately came up with our list of 100 makers in every discipline. And I'm just going to show a few of them to you in a minute. But first, I wanted to say just a little bit about this curatorial process that we went through, because I think most museums tend to act as if they were the sole authority. So you have often one curator, maybe a small team of curators, and they decide who should be in the exhibition. So the Whitney Biennial, for example, which is a great exhibition in its own right, that's 3 curators. Each of them gets 1 floor. They decide who's going to be in the show. It's their rationale from the get-go. And they have the total and sole say-so as to who is going to be included. This is not how we decided to do it. We wanted to do a project that was curated by the community and for the community of New York City. And again, that's all of New York City, not just Manhattan, but also Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx. So that was why we went out to all these nominators, and that is also why we went out to this larger jury. And what we, I think, have ended up with is a truly democratic and, if you like, a populist broad cross-section of what creativity looks like in New York City today. So some examples of people that we'll be including. First of all, and I wanted to start with this because it's maybe a little bit surprising, not something you'd normally expect to see in a museum. We're going to have a trumpet. And the trumpet is not made, but actually repaired by these amazing folks over in Brooklyn called Brass Lab. And they are the top brass instrument repair company in America. How many of you have heard of them? Brass Lab? Nobody, of course, because you're not professional musicians. But if you worked for the Philharmonic, especially if you were in the tuba, trumpet, or trombone section, you would depend on Brass Lab all the time because they are the people to call whenever your priceless 300-year-old brass instrument gets a ding or a knock in it. And so they're going to be providing us, or lending us, a trumpet which they have repaired, a very badly damaged instrument that they've brought back to be just like new. And one of the ideas that we had here in including the example of a company that focuses on repair rather than building something from scratch is that actually repair is a very creative thing, because when you have an object and you need to make it look like new, you have to be very adaptive. You have to take the situation as it's handed to you. You don't get to choose what kind of raw material you're going to be working with. You have to take that bashed up trumpet and do what you can with it. And so that's a great example of how our museum focuses on different kinds of creativity and different kinds of skill than you might normally see in an art and a design museum. Maybe a more typical example of something that you would see in a design museum is the work of these two folks who work mainly in plaster, Chen Chen and Kai Williams. And here you see really just a kind of domestic object, collectible that they make. And as you can see, it's a planter made out of the bottom of a pineapple. And it's a nice object. We'll actually be selling them in the store over the course of the exhibition. And you know, in and of itself, it's a pleasant enough and a kind of ingenious, fun object, but not necessarily something you would expect to find in a museum. But how about this object, which Chen Chen and Kai made from the dripped leftovers of all of the plaster that they were using to make those products. And so this is a complete one-off. It's a kind of giant planter or vase, and it's made entirely of the residue or the waste materials that went into the making, or in fact were produced by the making of these other objects. And this is, I think, another great subject for us, because it shows that by focusing on the entirety of the creative process, not just the original inspiration, not just the product itself, but also the byproduct of the product, you can find an incredible and expressive form of creative form that you otherwise wouldn't encounter at all. So again, this is a great example of how we focus on different aspects of creativity that you might not always find showcased in a museum. Another question that is often asked of us at the Museum of Art and Design is, okay, you're called the Museum of Arts and Design, what about fine art? Because we do have this history as a craft museum, and that encourages people to think, well, we must be focused principally on things like ceramics and weaving and maybe furniture, glass, metalwork, that kind of thing. But fine arts have often been considered to be outside of our purview because of that trajectory, because of that history. But I'm a firm believer in the idea that any museum that focuses on making and focuses on skills and know-how should look, again, at the entire range of making, not just functional objects, but also fine art objects. And so this is a great example. It's a work by an artist that we'll be featuring in NYC Makers, who's called Leslie Wayne, shows with Jack Shainman Gallery. And this is a little bit hard to believe, but what you're looking at here is an object that's actually entirely made of paint. It's got a small wooden armature behind it that allows it to hang on a wall. And then what she does is layer one after another color of paint, dragging them and manipulating them as she goes. And basically what she's done is to make a sculpture out of paint. And of course, this is a purely decorative object. It performs no use or function whatsoever. But what she's done is to show you how one person with a great amount of skill and knowledge of her material, her raw material, in this case being pigment, can actually create a sculptural object out of a material that's usually intended to be two-dimensional. We do, of course, want to focus on the traditional so-called crafts, and a good example of that would be Jeff Zimmerman. He's an artist who's, again, based here in New York City, shows with our gallery downtown, and these are some great examples of the way that he works with glass. And the reason that I wanted to include him is because another thing that's very important for our museum, generally speaking, and also very important for this particular exhibition, is that we wanted to focus on people at the highest possible level of skill. So the way that Jeff Zimmerman works is the traditional manner of creating glass vessels. I'm not sure if any of you have seen this done, but of course what you need to do is get the glass very, very hot. You have it on the end of the blowpipe. You're rotating the blowpipe constantly so the glass doesn't sag down on one side and fall on the floor. And what you're seeing there on the left are a series of vessels that he made where he was able to freeze the glass bubble exactly at the point of collapse. And you can see how the walls are buckling and wrinkling and starting to fall in against themselves. And then he was able to preserve, if you like, catch the glass in its moment of imminent disaster, and then slowly cool it down in an annealing oven until he could get exactly the form that he wanted. And then, of course, he sprays the silver and the pigment on top of that. So here you have somebody who's working right at the sort of high wire edge of what's possible to realize in his medium. And that idea of very intense, very extreme skill has always been very important to us at the museum, and it's something that, again, we're showcasing right across the board in this exhibition. Everyone that you see in NYC Makers is going to be somebody working at the very highest level of skill that's possible in their material. And then, of course, we also have great designers who are working in the city, like Lindsay Edelman, very celebrated lighting designer working out of Brooklyn. And one thing that I just wanted to say, and Lindsay is a great example of this, is that at MAD, we are a very strong believer in entrepreneurship and the creative economy more generally. So often, I think, when you go into an art museum, the message is very much about separation from the rest of the economy. The idea is that once something goes into a museum collection, for example, you can't buy or sell it anymore. It's sort of put in storage or put on display, and it's off the market. And similar to that is the idea that the museum stands in a detached position from what's happening out there in the world of commerce. And sometimes, in fact, museum curators and other museum professionals will even look down on the world of commerce and say that it's somehow beneath the register of museum work, which is meant to be more intellectual, maybe more purely aesthetic than that. And at MAD, we do not look at things that way. For one thing, I would point out that fine art museums are hardly detached from the world of commerce, and all you have to do is look at the results of an auction right after a specific artist has had a big monographic show at the Museum of Modern Art to draw that conclusion. But even beyond that, museums can, and we think should, get directly involved with creative enterprise in their own arena to support the makers that are doing excellent work and to point out that, in fact, there are individuals living all around us who are driving the economy forward. Often we don't know about them, or the general public doesn't know about them. Often it takes somebody like us to point these people out to the public. But as we always say, wherever you live in New York City, there's a maker somewhere in your backyard doing fantastic work, and what we're going to do is introduce you to them. So you could walk right past Lindsay Edelman's studio, for example, in Brooklyn, and never know that you're walking past the studio of one of the most innovative and successful lighting designers in the country, much less that most of the work is actually physically made there. And we're going to open that door and introduce you to that person. That's the kind of key idea of the exhibition. And then beyond that, what we want to do is work with creative practitioners and with entrepreneurs that are upholding these values of making. Because after all, if those people are not going to be there and not going to be working in the economy at large, creating this work, this excellent work of very high quality, then the entire world around us is going to be diminished. This idea of going backstage is maybe most literally exemplified in the exhibition by the Metropolitan Opera, who we are featuring both in the form of sets and also costumes that will be included in the show. And this was another key idea for us. We really wanted to lay emphasis, I suppose, on this idea of taking people back behind the facade, behind the shiny surfaces of New York City, and introducing them to the people behind the scenes that actually make things work. So the Metropolitan Opera is a fantastic example of that. You're sitting in an audience, just like you are right now, looking up at the stage, and you're probably paying attention to the singing, to the acting, maybe to the set design. But how often will you think about the people who actually physically realized the sets, like this one for the Fledermaus, which was performed last year at the Met? Or how often would you think about the people who do the immaculate beadwork on the costumes in the exhibition? And so again, we're going to be focusing on those people, the people that are actually making it possible for the performers and the directors, the musicians to do their work by creating the appropriate backdrop. Another kind of backstage, you might say, is taking people into the homes and public buildings of New York City and meeting the people who do the decoration for those spaces. So we're very proud in the exhibition, for example, to have the work of Miriam Ellner. She is the foremost American practitioner of the art of verre et glomisé, which is a French term. It means reverse painting on glass. And so what she does is to paint a scene on the back of, let's say, a glass partition or a door or window, and she does it backwards. So if you look at this image, for example, which is inspired by Japanese screens, what she does is first paint on the color that you see in the front, and then she paints every layer of paint behind it, so essentially building up the background from the foreground instead of the other way around. And this is a technique that's been used in architecture, especially, again, in architectural glass, for 300 or 400 years, going all the way back to France in the 17th century. And Miriam Ellner is one of the few people who still do it today, and obviously does it to a very, very high level. And again, very, very successful. Her work is all over New York City. Very few members of our public will have had a chance to see it because most of her work is in homes or other places that are not generally accessible. And so this is another great example of how we can take people behind the scenes and introduce them to somebody tremendously skilled who's living and working amongst us. What about tattoo design? This is, again, an area where most people don't necessarily expect to encounter makers in the museum, but we thought, although it presents certain challenges from a display point of view, why not introduce people to some of the most innovative tattoo artists in New York City? And I suppose one of the ideas here was that we wanted to also focus on urban techniques, things that have a special relationship to the city. So we also have graffiti, for example. It's another case where we've looked into that. And Amanda Wacob is maybe the most innovative and interesting tattoo artist that we were able to find in New York City. One interesting point is that I think we had more tattoo artists nominated by our pool of people than any other genre, so people clearly got the idea that this was an interesting area to look at. But Amanda is the one who made the cut, and as you can see, she does this wonderful, colorful, painterly kind of tattoo work. And the way that we'll be representing her in the exhibition is through a kind of slide show, rather than obviously having people standing there for 4 months showing off her workmanship. Although it's possible that we might have a fashion show and maybe even some DIY, you are there kind of live tattooing. In all seriousness, one thing that we are going to do is have a lot of making happening in the galleries. So we'll have, for example, a cake maker creating a gigantic cake over the course of a weekend, Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, and then we'll have a big cake eating party on Sunday afternoon. And of course the point there is to look at the techniques of cake decoration. Again, something that many people come into contact with in New York City over the course of their lives, often through a wedding, but how often do you actually get to meet the people behind these masterpieces of the confectionery art? And we'll have all sorts of other performances happening in the museum as well during the period the show is running. In fact, we've set aside a whole gallery for this kind of performance and demonstration, how-to events, and we've been internally calling it the uninsured space because there's no insured art in there, so we can do whatever we want in that space. So who knows, maybe we'll have some live tattooing happening come August. I think maybe the best example that we have in the exhibition of an unheralded, unacknowledged, behind-the-scenes craftsperson are the people at Box Art, who are actually the Museum of Arts and Design's own shipping company. And what they do is to build crates for sculptures and other objects that we send around, both to have objects lent to us and when we lend objects to other museums. And it occurred to us that, in fact, the people who build crates, and especially the armatures inside the crates, are some of the most skilled craftspeople that we know. So imagine that you have an extremely delicate, breakable object, and you need to get it from here to California, and you need to be absolutely sure that it's going to get there in one piece. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, you're going to call people like our folks at Box Art, and you're going to get them to make a crate for you with this beautifully constructed, intricate armature that holds up every part of the sculpture softly but securely, and make sure that it's going to be completely stable and completely impervious to damage. And so that's kind of like the instrument repair people. It's an adaptive form of creativity. You have to take what you're given and work with it. So the raw material, you could say, there is the sculpture. But it does prompt the thought that again, if you're thinking about making as this kind of unifying concept that runs right across all fields of creativity, and you're thinking about it on a totally level playing field, what about the idea that the sculptor, let's say Jeff Koons, and then the person who makes the sculpture, the fabricator, let's say Jeff Koons' assistants, and then the crate maker who ships the Jeff Koons sculpture, let's say we treated them all as if they were on an equal playing field. Obviously, you've heard of Jeff Koons. You probably haven't heard of his fabricator. You certainly haven't heard of his crate maker. But none of them could work successfully without the other. And so the idea is to create this truly democratic, across-the-board showcase for people's skills, no matter where it enters into the equation of art and design. And I think that's a very powerful idea. That's the kind of idea that, to me, makes us a totally unique and totally original kind of museum, again, a kind of museum that hasn't existed in the past. That total horizontality or kind of egalitarian way of looking at creativity. Although the museum only has 2 exhibition floors that are committed to this show, we're also going to populate the rest of the museum in terms of the back spaces, again, behind the scenes spaces, to the makers that we're showcasing. So for example, in the lobby, you see the Mad lobby as it generally appears here, again, right on the streetscape of 2 Columbus Circle. We're going to have these amazing people from Confetti System create a decoration, a kind of backdrop for that lobby. They are people that normally work as party planners, and they create and deliver and realize these extravagant decorated parties all across New York City. And what we're going to do is have them take the lobby and create a kind of ornamental, immersive space. So the minute people walk in out of Central Park or Columbus Circle, they're going to be suddenly plunged into this world of very intense creativity. And I think one really important thing there is that we really want this exhibition to be very appealing, very fun, very accessible. We do want it to feel kind of like a festival. After all, it is the summertime. And so we want people, the minute they walk into the museum, to feel that sense of lift, that sense that they've come to some place where they're really going to enjoy what's happening and they're going to encounter all kinds of marvelous things. And another example of that is that we're going to have a back stairway, which is going to be completely covered in wallpaper by these folks called Flavor Paper, who are the most innovative wallpaper manufacturers in the country. And this is not going to be just any wallpaper, but is going to be a scratch and sniff wallpaper. So you're going to be able to walk up the stairs and scratch on the different levels and get a different scent out of the walls. And so what we decided to do was work with a perfume designer. And what he's doing is he's designing a scent for us, the scent of creativity, he's calling it. And the way that it works is that on the first level of the wallpaper, you get the base notes of the perfume. And then the second level, you get the midtones of the perfume. And then the third level, the perfume is completed, you get the high notes. So it goes from those kind of dusky, musky smells that form the lowest register of the perfume to the highest, more floral tones at the top. And so you can actually understand how a perfume is built from scratch through this process. And then we're also working with a graphic designer who's going to create the decorative pattern for this wallpaper. So it's actually 3 makers in one, that back stairway. And so this is, again, another way that we're kind of activating the spaces of the museum. We also have something that we're very proud of at the museum, an open studio. And this is, in fact, something not unique to the NYC Makers show. It's something that we always have at the museum, up on our 6th floor. During any of our opening hours, you can go and meet a maker, meet somebody who's actually working in some creative field or other. And right now in our open studios, we have Chris Pelletieri. He is the professional stone carver for St. John the Divine Cathedral here in New York. And as it happens, just at the time that we decided to jury him into the exhibition, he lost his workshop over the cathedral because the space was needed for other uses. And so suddenly, this man who had been working at the cathedral for 20 years had nowhere to actually ply his trade. So we gave him an invitation to come over to the museum and spend a couple of months with us, and obviously that sort of gives him a place to be and a place to hang his chisels in the meantime. Sorry, there's the open studios. So that's where Chris is working now. And my last slide is me getting a lesson in stone carving, as you can see, not very appropriately dressed, from Chris Pelletieri. And so this is a great example of how hands-on works at the museum. And again, what we're going to try to do is fill the entire museum with this kind of activity, this kind of experience for our audience. So this is just one exhibition that I've told you about, NYC Makers. The biennial, of course, will carry on. We're looking at other cities that we might look at in 2016. I'll tell you confidentially that we might be doing Detroit next time round. We're also looking at cities in California, like the Bay Area, maybe Los Angeles. And who knows, eventually we may even go abroad. Wouldn't it be great to do a Paris Makers or Tokyo Makers or Lagos, Nigeria Makers exhibition at some point? So this is an idea that's going to run and run and run. You'll hear a lot about it in the news this summer. And I do very much hope that you can come and see the first installment of it. But beyond that, we're focusing on making across the board at the museum in all sorts of different ways. And I've already given you a couple of examples of the sorts of ideas that we're going to be pursuing in individual exhibitions. One that I'd like to tell you about is a show called Many Hands, Artists and Their Fabricators, which is going to be on next autumn. That's autumn 2015 at the museum. And that is, in fact, about artists like Jeff Koons and the people that fabricate their work for them. We'll be the first museum ever to do an exhibition on this subject that introduces the audience to not only the artist, but also the person who actually realizes the artist's work. And one last thing, which I will tell you, but I'm going to have to kill you if you repeat it, is that we are going to be doing an exhibition next spring in March about a TV program. And I will not name the TV program, but I'll just say it's a TV program that's been much in the news recently and would be of particular interest to the advertising industry. And we're going to be taking people behind the scenes to the way that this program is made. So we're going to be introducing our audience to the set decorators and designers. We're going to be introducing the audience to the costume designer and the costume fabricators, and then the prop master of this particular TV program. And you're going to be able to meet those people, and we're going to be showcasing some of the famous props, the famous costumes and famous sets from that show. So this is yet another example of the way that we bring people behind the scenes at the Museum of Arts and Design. And as a friend of mine pointed out to me, it's a really interesting fact that TV and film is the very last mass consumable product that's still made by hand, right? And so it's a perfect way for us to showcase the values that we believe in at the museum, which is to say skill, know-how, people who understand what they're doing, and bringing people directly in contact with the moment of creativity, the moment of making. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much. The exhibition will be on view from July 1st to October 20th of this year, and please come and see us then. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Or I could do my famous gargling act. That's my threat, if there's any question. Let's do that.
Hi. Jim Wojtowicz from San Francisco Academy of Art University. Same question, actually. The stuff you're doing is fantastic. Do you see it as furthering it through education and embedding it in that kind of thing?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that, in fact, because I think another implication of what I'm saying is, and another way in which we're very different from other museums, is that we don't think of education and curatorial as being different or separated. They're more like different emphases within one project. So in most museums, and again, I don't say this to be critical, it's a way of working that does actually have a lot of success. You have curators who create projects, choose artists, choose topics, choose works to display. And then you have educators that interpret that exhibition. What we do is to have our educators and our curators work together to stage experiences. And our curators know more about the artists, they know more about, let's say, the theoretical side of what people are making, and the educators know more about public outreach and public engagement. But we actually have them completely integrated. And in some ways, what we're trying to do here is really get the energy of our open studios to flow through the rest of the museum. So previously to my arrival, the open studios were kind of the education space, and the galleries were the curator's space. And what we're doing is now completely fusing those two. And one decision that we made in order to ensure that this would happen for NYC Makers is that we actually asked somebody from our education department, our head of public programs, Jake Usna, to act as the lead exhibition curator. So in some ways you could say that this is an exhibition, and in other ways you could say that this is an education event that lasts for almost 4 months, and some of the objects stay still for that time, and then a lot of them don't, right? So it's as much an education event as it is an exhibition. Yeah, Mary.
I have a quick question about logistics. Chris Pelletier, the stonemason, St. John the Divine, what kind of weight load are you dealing with at the museum? I mean, what floor is he on?
Right. He's actually making quite a small object for us. He's making this very interesting sculpture, this two-faced sculpture that represents the two sides of New York City, he says. So we're seeing how that's developing now. But we do have some very heavy objects in the show. Weight load is not generally a problem for us. What is a problem is size. Because those of you who have been to the museum might have taken the elevator up to some floor or other, and it's a standard passenger elevator, and that's our only way of getting anything from one floor to another in the museum. So anything that's bigger than our passenger elevator, we can't actually display. So that means that the sorts of things that they do over the Turbine Hall and Tate Modern in London are pretty much out. So that encourages us to focus on smaller scale, intimate encounters with objects. But obviously that's another great reason to think about making, because as long as somebody comes with their tools, then something magical can happen. It doesn't need to be gigantic in scale. Another exhibition that we are thinking about, by the way, which won't happen for a while, maybe even 2017, is a show about cars, about automobiles. And you might say, Glenn, you only have a small passenger elevator. How are you going to do a show about cars? Does anyone have a guess how we're going to do it? Taking the car apart, exactly. So what we're going to do is take cars, let's say a Ferrari, and we're going to explode it into all of its pieces, and then we're going to show the audience how each of those pieces is individually made. So who does the stitching on the upholstery for the seats? Who makes the steering wheel? How do you make a fender for a one-off luxury car? What about the computer and digital design that goes into the steering and transmission assemblies? So we're going to be showing people all of the different crafts and skills and technical requirements that goes into a car. So sometimes it's just like advertising. Sometimes the constraints are the creative driver. Okay, thank you all very much for your attention.